Hello, my name is Journey Cross, and 2 months ago, my own mother stood in a courtroom and called me unfit to raise my son. She said I was unstable, that I couldn't keep a job. My father sat beside her and nodded. My son was there too. He heard it all. He looked at me like he wasn't sure who to believe. And my ex-husband, he just smiled, like he'd already won. But they didn't know who I really was. They didn't expect me to call the Chief Justice. So now I have to ask, when your own family testifies against you, not out of truth but out of convenience, how far are you willing to go to reclaim your name? The courthouse smelled like paper and bleach, cold, efficient, hollow. I'd been in and out of courtrooms for nearly 15 years, but that morning, sitting on the polished wooden bench outside courtroom 3B, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not fear, not nerves. It was something deeper. Like standing in your own house and realizing the floor underneath you had shifted just slightly, but enough that you knew it'd never feel like home again. I looked down at Calder, my 9-year-old. His small hand gripped mine like he was holding onto a rope in a storm. His jacket was too big on him. He'd insisted on wearing the blazer I'd bought him for picture day last year. "Do I look like someone who could win in court?" he asked with the most serious face. I had to smile, even if just for him. "You look like someone who's already won," I said, brushing back a bit of hair from his forehead. He grinned, and I kissed the top of his head. "We're just going to talk to the judge, that's all." That was a lie. A gentle one, but still a lie. I pushed the courtroom door open just as the clerk called, "Cross v. Mohler, custody hearing." Rafferty was already seated with his lawyer. He was dressed like a magazine ad, custom suit, perfect tie knot, even the cufflinks gleamed. He looked up at me, and for a moment, I saw the man I married a decade ago. Then he smirked, just a twitch at the corner of his mouth. Not for me, for himself. His lawyer leaned in, whispered something. Rafferty didn't respond, just nodded, then looked toward the back of the courtroom. I followed his gaze. That's when I noticed them. My parents, Isolde and Delaney Cross, sitting behind Rafferty. On his side, my body didn't move, but something inside me cracked. My mother sat upright, legs crossed at the ankle, a silk scarf wrapped tightly around her neck like it was holding something in. My father didn't look at me at all. Calder tugged at my hand. "Why is Grandma over there?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. I just led him to the seat beside my attorney. The judge entered, called the session to order. We stood, then sat. I could feel Rafferty's gaze flicking toward me, like he was watching a trap snap shut. When the clerk called, "Next witness, Isolde Cross," the room shifted. She stood. She stood. I didn't react, not outwardly, but I knew, deep in my marrow, that this wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a mistake. This was betrayal. Isolde took the stand with the kind of poise that would have impressed a country club brunch crowd. When asked to state her relation to the case, she said, "I'm Journey Cross's mother." Then came the first cut. "She's unstable," she said without flinching. "She can't hold a job. She's been in and out of therapy since her 20s. She disappears for days at a time." I wanted to stand up and shout, "You don't even know what I do," but I stayed seated. My dad nodded in quiet agreement when asked if he shared her concerns. Not a word, just a nod. The same nod he gave me the day I graduated law school. Like he was acknowledging I'd done something decent, but not worth clapping for. Calder turned his head toward me. I felt it more than saw it. I looked down, and there it was. His face. Frozen. Mouth slightly open. Eyebrows lifted. Not in surprise, but in confusion. Fear. The kind kids feel when they realize the adults are lying and it's too late to pretend otherwise. I reached for his hand, but he pulled it away and clasped it in his lap. That moment, it didn't break me, but it carved something out of me I know will never grow back. My attorney leaned toward me, whispered, "Do you want to object?" I shook my head. I wasn't ready. I needed to hear everything, all of it, because when someone lies about you that publicly, that viciously, your instinct is to fight. But sometimes the smarter move is to wait. Let them bury themselves in their own words. Let the court record soak in their version. then burn it all down with the truth. I listened to my mother describe me like I was some wandering, unhinged woman, incapable of raising a houseplant, let alone a child. She drives an old car, she added. Lives in a small apartment downtown. She can't even afford to take Calder to baseball games. I wanted to laugh. That apartment is a penthouse, and Calder hates baseball. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was her tone, controlled, calculated, coded in a faux concern that made it all sound so reasonable. When the judge finally turned to me and asked, "Ms. Cross, would you like to respond to your parents' testimony?" I opened my mouth and closed it. Not yet. Not like this. I glanced at Calder. His hands were clenched in his lap now, and he was staring at the floor. I took a breath, exhaled slowly. "I need to hear everything first," I said, voice steady. "Then I'll speak." The air in the courtroom hadn't changed, but something inside me had. I hadn't moved from my seat. My posture remained the same, shoulders square, hands resting in my lap, back straight, but I no longer felt like a woman being judged. I felt like a witness, watching a show I hadn't been invited to, but one that was clearly rehearsed without me. I could still hear my mother's voice echoing in my head, cool, steady, rehearsed like a script she had practiced for days. She didn't even stutter, and my father, who'd always claimed to stay out of women's business, had nodded right along, like every insult was gospel. But that wasn't the part that bruised. It was Calder. The way he had looked at me, confused, scared, like he didn't know whether to believe me or believe them. That hesitation, that pause between mother and doubt, that was the fracture I hadn't prepared for. And that fracture was still spreading, quietly. I kept my gaze forward, but I could feel eyes on me. Not the judge's, not even Rafferty's. No, this was something else. And then I saw it. Rafferty, across the courtroom, sitting just behind his sleek, soulless attorney. His shoulders relaxed, his jawline sharp. His smirk, subtle, smug, sinister, appeared the moment our eyes met. He knew exactly what he was doing. His lawyer leaned over and whispered something. Rafferty didn't blink. He nodded once, slowly, like a man confirming a delivery had arrived on time. That's when I realized this wasn't a surprise to him. None of it. He'd planned this. The witnesses, the narrative, the optics. And he wasn't alone. Behind him, on the second row, sat Selphia, my sister. She looked down at her lap, avoiding my eyes. That, more than anything, told me everything I needed to know. I'd always known Selphia could be calculating, but I used to believe that, at the very least, she'd stay out of something like this. Family court. A custody fight. My son. Apparently, I was wrong. I remembered the text she'd sent me 3 nights before the hearing. Casual. Innocent-looking. "Maybe it's better for Calder to stay with Raf. He needs more structure. You work too much anyway." I hadn't responded then. I just assumed she was trying to avoid taking sides. Now I realized she'd already chosen one. Not mine. The judge called a recess, and as everyone began shifting and stretching, I stayed put. Calder was still seated with my mother and Selphia, 2 rows behind Rafferty. His little shoulders curled inward, head tilted slightly down. I didn't dare look back too long. I couldn't show weakness, not here, not now. But that didn't mean I wasn't paying attention. They'd all made one mistake. They assumed I'd come into this courtroom only as a mother. They forgot who I really was. I'd spent over a decade in courtrooms across the state. Not as a plaintiff, not as a defendant, as a judge. A neutral, restrained, fair voice in rooms where chaos often ruled. I'd seen manipulations, theatrics, weaponized narratives dressed up as concern. I'd seen people lie, sob, confess, and deflect. I'd also seen what happened when they underestimated the quietest person in the room. They had no idea what I'd been holding back. While the bailiff stepped forward to check the time with the clerk, I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a thin folder. Not legal documents, not yet, just a personal log I'd kept since the day Rafferty served me the first custody petition. Timelines, comments, witness behavior, contradictions, patterns. I flipped the folder open and started taking notes. Methodical, clean, silent. Who said what? What time? To whom? What was omitted? What suddenly appeared? They thought they were smart. But I'd been documenting everything, not because I planned to use it, but because for someone like me, tracking details was breathing. I wasn't angry anymore. I was awake. I didn't need to yell. I didn't need to throw accusations or beg for sympathy. I just needed to remember that I was the only one in this room who had made decisions that had stood under appellate review. And now, this was mine to decide. The bailiff called the room back into session. The judge entered. We stood, we sat. Rafferty leaned back slightly in his chair, still radiating confidence like a man who had no idea the tide was about to shift. Then, I caught movement in the corner of my eye. Someone had entered the back row quietly. They sat down with their hands folded, posture formal, expression unreadable. I turned my head slightly, careful not to draw attention. And when I saw who it was, my stomach clenched. Not from fear, but from something deeper, something older. Sterling Mohler, Rafferty's older brother. He hadn't been present in any of the meetings. No mention in filings, no witness list. But there he was, watching, evaluating. I hadn't seen Sterling in over a year. Not since the night of the charity fundraiser when he'd pulled me aside and said, "You're too smart to stay in his shadow journey. Don't let him bury you in it." That night had been one of the last cracks in my marriage. Rafferty never knew what his brother had said. And now, seeing Sterling here, today of all days, set off alarm bells I couldn't ignore. He gave me a subtle nod, nothing more. Why was he here? What did he know? Was he watching to support me? Or to warn me? I didn't have answers, not yet, but my instincts told me one thing. This wasn't over. It hadn't even begun. He didn't belong there, not in that courtroom, not seated quietly in the back row like a silent observer with no skin in this game. But there he was. Sterling Mohler, Rafferty's older brother, watching the proceedings with the kind of stillness that made me uneasy. His presence wasn't loud or confrontational. It was worse than that. It was intentional. He didn't smile like Rafferty. He didn't smirk or glance sideways at the judge. Sterling didn't need to. He made you feel like he was already 10 steps ahead and that whatever you thought you were controlling, he'd already accounted for. He caught my eye and gave me a subtle nod. A flick of acknowledgement that wasn't warm or cold, just aware. I didn't nod back. I kept my face flat, impassive. But inside, my thoughts were unraveling in long, jagged strips. Why now? Why today? My memory didn't hesitate to pull me 2 weeks backward, to a dinner I'd tried hard to forget, but now realized I should have dissected from the beginning. It had been a Thursday night, one of those midweek evenings when exhaustion sets in early. Rafferty had texted, "Let's grab dinner, just to talk about Calder." I hadn't said yes right away. I remember sitting on my couch, reading that message over and over, debating whether this was a trap or a chance to co-parent like adults. Against my better judgment, and maybe out of that tired part of me that still wanted him to grow up, I agreed. We met at a quiet steakhouse near the river. He was already seated when I arrived, smiling like someone who knew his charm still worked in small doses. He ordered a bottle of wine before I even sat down, something I waved off with a simple, "Just water, thanks." He didn't argue, just nodded and shifted topics with the ease of a man who'd rehearsed. We talked about Calder, his school, his bedtime routine, how he was struggling with math. Rafferty seemed relaxed, not smug, not manipulative. He asked about my work schedule, which cases I was buried in, how often I had to travel for judicial conferences. And somewhere in the middle of the meal, just as the waitress brought our entrees, he dropped the line. "So, do you think you'll keep full custody long-term? Or, do you think it might make sense for Calder to spend more time with me now that things are more stable?" At the time, I blinked. Not in shock, not even in anger. I assumed it was a poorly phrased suggestion, one of those ill-timed dad moments when he tried to sound involved but missed the tone completely. I had smiled politely and said, "I think he's adjusting well to the current arrangement." Then I moved on. Changed the subject, thought nothing more of it. But sitting in that courtroom now, watching his brother appear like a shadow that had been lurking just outside the frame, I realized that question was never casual. It was calculated. He'd been probing me, collecting data, noting my tone, my facial expressions, maybe even the exact wording I used, all to weave a story he could sell to the court. A narrative where he was the stable one, the involved parent, the safe harbor. And I'd given him the rope. I pressed my thumb and index finger together beneath the table. A grounding technique I'd learned during judicial ethics training for when the emotional lines blurred too much. Quiet pressure on the skin, just enough to refocus. He was building a case that night. I was just too tired to see it. My mind spun back through that dinner, rewinding the way a judge rewinds testimony, word by word, pause by pause, every compliment he'd made about Calder's progress, every observation about my workload, every smile that had just a little too much timing behind it. He had played me, not emotionally, not romantically, strategically, like I was an opposing counsel he needed to lull into a false sense of security before presenting evidence that would flip the case. And I, with all my experience, all my judgment, had walked straight into it. I felt my spine lengthen in the courtroom seat. I wasn't angry, not in the way people expect. No raised voice, no clenched fists. It wasn't even rage. It was precision, cold, sharp clarity. I opened my folder again, added a new bullet under the pattern of pre-mediation section. Dinner conversation, timeline of comments suggests strategic probing. From this point forward, I would not just be his ex-wife. I would be the quiet record keeper, the observer who doesn't react, only documents. And when the time came, I'd present that truth, not with drama, but with structure, backed by every line he ever crossed. The court session resumed. The judge asked if either party wanted to present supplemental remarks before continuing with witnesses. Rafferty declined. His lawyer said, "We'll proceed as submitted, Your Honor." I kept my lips sealed. Let them get comfortable. Let them believe I was stunned, wounded, backed into a corner. That illusion would work to my advantage. We cycled through one more minor witness, someone from the school's administration, a brief statement about drop-offs and pickups. Neutral, unremarkable. They were stacking the deck gently, playing the long game. The judge called for a short recess. As I gathered my things into a neat stack, I stood and turned, intending to walk past Rafferty without so much as a glance, but he stepped into my path as though he'd been waiting for me. No smile this time, just a quiet, smug sentence. "I warned you not to make this hard." I didn't blink. I didn't flinch. I leaned in, just enough for my voice to drop beneath the courtroom murmur. "You've always mistaken quiet for weak. That's your first mistake, and it won't be your last." Then I turned, walked to the hallway, and pulled out my phone. It was time to make a few calls. I didn't go back to my seat right away. After Rafferty dropped that little line, "I warned you not to make this hard." I needed a moment alone, not to cry, not to panic, just to think, strategically, cleanly. I stepped into the hallway, walked past the vending machines, and sat on the bench near the window. Outside, the gray Virginia sky hadn't changed, still dull, still heavy, the kind of weather that felt like a held breath. Inside, I felt the same. My phone buzzed. A message lit up the screen from Claire, a paralegal who used to clerk in my chambers before transferring to a private firm. She was loyal, sharp, and more importantly, still had friends in the system. Walking past 3B in 2 minutes. "Have something for you." I stood, shook out the tension from my shoulders, and started walking back toward the courtroom entrance. Right on cue, Claire approached from the opposite end, a manila folder tucked under her arm like a stack of takeout menus. She didn't speak, just brushed by me and slipped it into my bag without breaking stride. Anyone watching would have thought she was someone I passed every day in the hallway. No eye contact, no acknowledgement. Back in my seat, I opened the folder. Most of the contents were dry, routine evidence lists, procedural copies, but one page had a red tab stuck to the corner, scribbled with Claire's handwriting. "Thought you'd want to see this. No one flagged it." It was a transcript entry. Small font, 2 lines of text. Exhibit 14, audio transcript, phone session, July 14th. I read it again. July 14th. And then it hit me. That was the night I'd sat in my car, engine off, parked outside of Calder's soccer practice. I'd had a session with my therapist over the phone. 1 hour, confidential, protected, off the record. It hadn't been an emergency call. It wasn't dramatic. I hadn't cried, but I'd been honest. I told her I was tired, that I felt like I was failing at home because I worked too much, and at work because I worried about Calder. I'd said, "Sometimes I feel like I'm just barely keeping it together." I remember laughing through it, laughing and saying, "But I always do. I always pull it off." It was supposed to be just that. A private, professional moment between a woman who carries too much and the one person she didn't have to pretend with. But it was here, on paper, in an evidence list. How? How did they get that call? I hadn't recorded it. My therapist wouldn't. She's meticulous about ethics. Even if it had been a Zoom session, the consent form would have barred that. That left one explanation. Rafferty had recorded it. I didn't know how. Maybe he bugged my car. And maybe he had someone monitoring my phone. Maybe he found some sleazy workaround through legal gray zones. Whatever the method, the message was clear. He had crossed a line, a sacred one, and he intended to use my private doubts as proof that I was unfit to raise my son. My stomach didn't churn, it tightened, cold and hard, like I'd swallowed ice. I didn't flinch outwardly, not with Rafferty still sitting 2 tables over, tapping his pen like he was marking time. But inside I was ice and iron. I let my guard down for 1 hour, I whispered to myself, so low no one could hear. 1 hour, and he turned it into a weapon. That was enough. I stood, walked to the hallway again, this time with purpose. I moved past the water fountain, past the restroom signs, and toward the far end where reception was empty. I took out my phone, dialed a number from memory. "Langley Investigations," the voice on the other end answered. "This is Journey Cross," I said, calm and clipped. "I need a full sweep on any digital intrusion over the last 6 months, specifically around July 14th. Phones, email, GPS, anything with access to private calls." "Who's the target?" the investigator asked. "Rafferty Mohler," I replied, "and anyone connected to his legal team." There was a pause. Then, "Understood. Anything else?" "Yes," I said. "If he bugged my car or my phone, I want a timestamp. And I want a name attached to the installation. Don't just find it, track it." I hung up, exhaled slowly, and turned back toward the courtroom. But I didn't walk in just yet. As I approached the doorway, I caught a figure leaning against the wall to the side, phone pressed tightly to her ear. Selphia, my sister. She didn't see me at first. She was half turned away, voice low, hushed. I couldn't make out the words, but I caught the tone. Defensive. Quiet. Careful. She was whispering. Selphia never whispers. I watched her, waiting to catch a name or phrase, just something. But she glanced over her shoulder, then looked away. It wasn't guilt in her eyes. It was fear. She was in on something, or at least aware of something she shouldn't be. And that was when I knew I wasn't the only one keeping secrets in this family. She hung up quickly when she noticed me watching. Her hands dropped to her sides like someone caught with a lit match in a room full of gasoline. Selphia always prided herself on her composure, but in that moment, on that phone, whispering like a high schooler cheating on a test, she looked exactly how I felt the first time I realized our mother could lie with a straight face. Cornered. Exposed. I didn't say a word as she slipped past me in the hallway. She didn't make eye contact. I let her get a few steps ahead before I followed. There was a small conference room near the end of the corridor, barely used except during trial prep or mediations. She pushed the door open without knocking, stepped inside, and let it close behind her. I waited 5 seconds, just long enough to ensure she wouldn't double back. Then I turned the knob and walked in like I had every right to be there. She looked up from her bag, startled but trying not to show it. The windowless room was lit with tired fluorescent bulbs, casting a yellowish hue across the table and chairs. She straightened her spine and gave me that half smile she'd mastered since childhood. The one that said, "I'm the reasonable one here." "Did you need something?" she asked, slipping her phone into her purse like I hadn't just seen her use it to arrange my downfall. I didn't answer her question. Instead, I walked to the table, unzipped my briefcase, and pulled out 2 sheets of paper. The first one was the transcript, Exhibit 14, July 14th, the illegally obtained therapy session Rafferty's team planned to submit. I placed it in front of her. She didn't look at it right away. She just stared at me, waiting for me to speak. "You're smarter than this," I said quietly. "You know what this is." Selphia folded her arms. "I don't know where that came from." Her voice was even. Too even. She wasn't denying what it was, just pretending she had no connection to it. I let her sit in that silence. Then I reached back into my bag and slid out the second document, thicker, sealed, marked confidential, custody filing, Commonwealth of Virginia. Her face changed, not dramatically, just a flicker around her eyes. But I caught it. I slid the envelope forward. "I never opened it," I said. "Not until last night." Selphia didn't reach for it. She didn't need to. She knew exactly what was inside. "5 years ago," I continued, "you filed to give primary custody of Tessa to your ex. You cited stress, emotional exhaustion, said you weren't in a place to be a full-time parent." She finally looked down. Her fingers played with the edge of the envelope, not opening it, just toying with it like it might bite. "I kept that secret because you asked me to," I added. "You told Mom and Dad you had joint custody, that it was your choice, not the court's." I never corrected them. She said nothing. "You stood in court 2 hours ago and listened to Mom call me unfit," I said. "You nodded when she said I couldn't provide stability. You watched me sit there while the man who emotionally neglected me for years painted me as a risk to my child." Selphia's eyes lifted to meet mine, finally. "You don't know what it was like," she said, her voice softer now. "To wake up every morning and feel like you were drowning, like you'd already failed before the day started." My breath caught, just slightly, because I did know. I knew exactly. But this wasn't about understanding. This was about choice. "You're right," I said. "I don't know what it felt like, but I do know what you did with it. You walked away. And that was your right. But don't you dare sit in this courtroom and nod along while they question my motherhood like I'm not bleeding every day to make it work." Her face twisted. Guilt, anger, maybe both. "I fixed my life," she snapped. "I did what I had to do. You hide behind yours, the robe, the courthouse, the perfect schedule. You think you're above needing help." That hit harder than I wanted it to, because part of it was true. I'd buried myself in work so I wouldn't have to feel the cracks forming. I'd used my job as both armor and alibi, but the difference was I'd never walked away, not from Calder. I leaned forward across the table. "If you don't walk away from this case, Selphia, if you don't tell the truth about what you know, about how they're twisting everything to fit a lie, then that sealed file won't stay sealed." Her jaw tensed. "This is the last time I'm going to protect you," I said. The room went quiet. There was no shouting, no slammed doors, just the sound of fluorescent lights humming above us and the weight of everything that had never been said pressing down like a second ceiling. I stood, packed my briefcase, and turned toward the door. Behind me, Selphia hadn't moved. She didn't ask me to stay. She didn't defend herself. She just sat there, eyes down, hands flat on the table. I pulled the door shut behind me, the click of the latch louder than it should have been. I left that conference room without looking back. The weight of Selphia's silence followed me down the hallway like a shadow that refused to detach. I didn't slam the door behind me. I didn't need to. The finality of that conversation spoke louder than anything else could have. The courtroom had settled again, its rhythm slow but heavy. Afternoon light filtered weakly through the blinds, casting pale lines across the floor. I walked in, returned to my seat, and nodded once to my attorney. She leaned in. "You okay?" "Better than okay," I murmured, keeping my eyes ahead. Let them make their move. The judge called the court back into session. Her voice was firm, neutral, but I could hear the fatigue underneath. Even she wasn't immune to the weight of this day. Rafferty's lawyer stood. He adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and stepped forward like a man holding the final card in a rigged game. "Your Honor," he began, With the court's permission, we'd like to enter supplemental evidence under Rule 5.3, mental health records relevant to parental fitness. My stomach tightened, not from fear, but from recognition. I knew what was coming. This was the part where they stopped pretending to be decent. He passed a manila folder to the bailiff, who handed it to the judge. This psychological evaluation, the lawyer continued, was conducted 5 years ago following a deeply traumatic event. It was submitted by Dr. Calvin Harwin. The report raises serious concerns about the petitioner's emotional stability and ability to provide consistent care. I didn't blink, I didn't flinch. But I did breathe, long, slow, deliberate. That report wasn't fake, it was real. But what he didn't say, and what the judge wouldn't know from the page, was that it had been taken entirely out of context. 5 years ago, I'd had a miscarriage, and in the months that followed, I'd done something responsible. I sought help. I sat with a therapist and answered every question honestly. I told her about the days I couldn't get out of bed, the nights I left the light on because I couldn't face the dark, the mornings I showed up to court and ruled on custody disputes while holding my own grief in my throat like glass. Dr. Harwin had evaluated me, yes. He'd also cleared me, said I was grieving, not unwell, that I was functioning, not fractured. But that part didn't make it into the packet. They had cherry-picked quotes, highlighted phrases like emotional volatility and expressed doubts about future motherhood. It read like a confession, not context. It was a manipulation wrapped in medical credibility. I watched the judge as she read the document. She didn't react, but I saw her eyebrows tighten slightly, just enough to tell me she was processing, not judging. Yet, across the aisle, Rafferty leaned back in his chair like a man satisfied with his hand. He didn't even look at me. I almost hoped he would, just for the chance to let him see I hadn't crumbled. Not even close. The judge looked up. "Petitioner, do you wish to respond to this filing?" I stood. "Not at this time, Your Honor." And I sat back down. My attorney turned toward me, confused. I shook my head once, gently. "Let it sit," I whispered. "I'm not done yet." Court recessed for 15 minutes. I stepped into the hallway again, this time heading toward the end of the corridor where the Wi-Fi signal was strongest. I needed a moment, not to breathe, but to act. I dialed. "Langley," came the voice on the other end. "It's Journey. Send everything we discussed, the sealed files, digital traces, and the phone tracking data. I want it all formatted for judicial review. It needs to hit Judge Morrison's desk before the afternoon adjournment." Langley didn't hesitate. "Already compiling. You'll have it in 20 minutes. As I ended the call, my phone buzzed again. This time a message from my attorney's assistant. "You need to see this. Calder's teacher just sent it." Attached was a scan of a school emergency contact form. Under primary guardian, the name listed was not mine. It was Marlene Mohler, Rafferty's mother. I stood there for a moment, letting that sink in. They hadn't just questioned my parenting. They hadn't just twisted my private records. They had erased me, replaced my name on my son's school records like I was a placeholder they could swap out, like I was a mistake they were correcting. I scrolled down further. There was a note in the margin, sloppily written in pen. "Mother frequently unavailable due to work." My teeth clenched so tightly my jaw popped. My vision blurred just enough to make the edges of the hallway shimmer. This wasn't legal maneuvering anymore. This was personal. This was war. I walked to the bathroom, locked myself in a stall, and pressed both hands against the cold metal wall. My breath came shallow but controlled. I counted to 10. I thought of Calder, of the night he fell asleep in my lap after his fever broke, of the mornings he slipped notes into my purse that said, "Love you, Mama. Don't forget to eat." I thought of every sacrifice. Every night I skipped dinners, social events, even my own health appointments, because being his mother came first. And they had the audacity to erase my name? Not today. Not ever. 15 minutes later, I re-entered the courtroom. My stride steady, my shoulders squared. I didn't look at Rafferty. I looked at the judge. She gave a small nod, and we resumed. As the bailiff re-announced the case, I caught Rafferty's eyes, finally, He smirked again, and I smiled, not the soft, placating smile he used to know, a different one. Colder, certain. He wanted war. He had it. The moment the judge called us back into session, I stood. My breath was even, my spine tall. Whatever image of me they had built over the last few hours, shaken, defeated, cornered, was about to be replaced by something far less convenient for them. The judge looked up from her notes. Ms. Cross, would you like to respond to the psychological evidence submitted by Mr. Mohler's counsel? I met her gaze squarely. Yes, Your Honor, I said calmly. Then, after a brief pause, but I won't be the one speaking first. There was a ripple of confusion through the courtroom. From the corner of my eye, I saw Rafferty straighten, his smirk twitching into something less confident. His lawyer turned slightly, eyebrows lifting. They hadn't been warned of anything. That was intentional. I walked toward the double doors at the back of the room. Each footstep echoed louder than the one before it. I opened the door. He was already waiting. Chief Justice Howard Barrett stepped forward without hesitation, his presence commanding the attention of every soul in the room. Not a whisper, not a cough, just the sound of realization breaking over the crowd like a wave. I'd like to call Chief Justice Barrett to the stand, I announced, my voice firm and clear. Someone gasped. My mother, I think. Rafferty's lawyer dropped his pen. The judge blinked. To her credit, she recovered quickly, adjusting her glasses and nodding. Proceed. Barrett approached the witness stand with the calm of a man used to being the final voice in a courtroom. He took the oath without ceremony, his voice even and unapologetically direct. Chief Justice Barrett, the judge began, please identify the petitioner for the court. He looked directly at me. The petitioner is the Honorable Journey Cross, currently serving as Appellate Justice of the Commonwealth of Virginia. Silence. Cold, stunned silence. She has served in this capacity for the last 8 years, he continued, and prior to that, she was a Superior Court judge for 6 years. She has adjudicated high-profile cases, authored published decisions on child welfare reform, and has received multiple citations for judicial integrity. I didn't turn to look at anyone. I didn't need to. I could feel the shift. The woman they thought they were tearing down was someone they had never truly known. Barrett went on. Justice Cross's annual salary is $195,000, with full judicial pension and benefits. She owns her residence outright and maintains a second property used for retreats related to judicial ethics training. Her financial disclosures are a matter of public record. Rafferty's lawyer opened his mouth, closed it. No objection came. He had nothing. And her psychological evaluation submitted to this court, Barrett continued, voice never rising, was pulled from a closed counseling session following a miscarriage. That record was never meant for litigation. It was weaponized out of context. I consider that a grave breach of ethics. He paused. And I'll be filing a formal complaint with the Bar Review Board regarding that misuse. The judge cleared her throat, obviously trying to maintain composure. Noted. I glanced toward Rafferty. His face had lost color. The confident gleam in his eyes had dulled into something closer to panic. Beside him, my mother looked down at her lap. My father didn't blink. I should have felt satisfaction. I didn't. What I felt was relief. It wasn't just that the truth had been spoken. It was that it had come from someone with authority Rafferty couldn't refute. Someone who knew me not as a mother or a daughter or a divorcee, but as a colleague, as a professional, as a woman who had spent her entire life upholding the law while others twisted it. After Barrett stepped down from the stand, the judge addressed the room. I believe we've heard enough on this matter for the moment. We'll recess for 1 hour and reconvene for closing recommendations. As people stood and gathered their belongings, I remained seated. I felt a hand touch my arm gently. Calder. He'd come from the bench where he'd been seated with a court-appointed advocate. He looked up at me, eyes wide, not with fear, but with something else. Pride. Mom, he whispered, why didn't you tell me you were a judge? I smiled, finally, something soft breaking through the steel I'd worn all day. Because I wanted you to love me for being your mom, not for what I do. He nodded once. I still do. I kissed the top of his head. As I rose, I turned to face the three people who had tried to strip me of everything I'd built: Rafferty, Selphia, and my mother. "You built a version of me that never existed," I said, not raising my voice, just speaking plainly. "Now the world sees the one that does." I walked away before they could answer. The judge didn't recess. Rafferty's attorney had stood, asking for a break, his voice unusually thin, no longer carrying that performative authority he'd maintained all day. But Judge Morrison simply looked at him over the rim of her glasses and said, "Denied. The court will proceed." I could see him swallow hard before sitting down. The courtroom remained hushed, but there was a charge in the air now, like the oxygen had thickened and everyone had to breathe slower, quieter, afraid to disturb what was about to unfold. Chief Justice Barrett hadn't left yet. He sat calmly in the gallery, posture straight, hands folded. His presence alone was a statement. Whatever narrative Rafferty had built, whatever story my family thought they could spin, it had just collided with something immovable. The clerk walked to the bench, passing the judge a stack of documents. "These were provided by Chief Justice Barrett," she said, keeping her voice neutral. The judge flipped through the top few pages, scanning them before setting them down with care. "These records," she announced, "include Justice Cross's professional evaluations, financial disclosures, ethics board recognitions, and her judicial opinions on cases involving child welfare." My attorney didn't speak. She didn't need to. Neither did I. The documents spoke for themselves. Page after page, the truth unfolded, not the emotional arguments, not the character assassinations, but the facts, my income, my rulings, my role in shaping family law reforms, the programs I'd built for low-income single mothers navigating the system, the mentoring I'd done for first-year female law clerks, all of it laid out in black and white, validated, and undeniable. "She's made decisions that have saved hundreds of children," Chief Justice Barrett had said moments ago. Yet here she stands, fighting for her own. Across the room, I caught a glimpse of Rafferty's face. The smug veneer had finally cracked. He wasn't leaning back in his chair anymore. His shoulders were forward, his eyes darting between the judge and his lawyer, and my parents. God! Isolde looked like she'd shrunk 2 inches, her back no longer perfectly straight, her legs crossed tighter than before. She refused to meet my eyes. Delaney sat motionless, his hands pressed flat on his thighs like he was bracing for impact. That's all they had left now, bracing. The judge tapped her pen once against the wood. "Miss Cross," she said, addressing me directly, "would you like to submit your final statement before I render a ruling?" I stood and walked toward the center of the courtroom. I didn't look at my ex-husband. I didn't scan for my sister or gauge my parents' reactions. This wasn't about them anymore. It was about Calder. "I didn't hide my job out of shame," I said, loud enough for every person in that room to hear me without raising my voice. "I did it to give my son a normal childhood, one where he wasn't defined by what I do, one where he could just be a kid, not the son of a judge." I paused, letting that land before continuing. "But that choice, to protect him from the pressure of my position, has been twisted into a weapon, used to paint me as deceitful, as unfit. That's what this courtroom has become today, a place where perception was manipulated and the truth distorted." I turned to Judge Morrison, steady and grounded. "I respectfully request full physical custody of Calder," I said. "I ask that his father be required to complete co-parenting education before being granted unsupervised visitation, and I ask that extended family, anyone who participated in the submission of false or misleading information, be barred from influencing decisions about my son's life moving forward." I returned to my seat. My knees didn't tremble, my hands didn't shake. I felt no fire, no fury, just clarity. And beneath that, something even rarer in a courtroom: peace. The judge nodded slowly. "Thank you, Ms. Cross." She turned her attention back to the bench, reviewed the documents one last time, then exhaled. "Given the misrepresentation of facts by witnesses," she began, "the submission of improperly contextualized evidence, and the overwhelming professional credibility demonstrated by the petitioner, I am granting full custody to Ms. Journey Cross." A breath caught in the gallery. A few people gasped quietly. Calder's court-appointed advocate gave the smallest nod of approval. The judge continued, Mr. Mohler will be allowed supervised visitation, pending the successful completion of parenting education. Extended family members involved in prior testimony will not be permitted to attend or influence scheduled visitations without explicit court approval. It was over. Not just the case. The war. The rewriting of who I was, by my ex, my sister, my own parents, had been stopped. Finally, I turned and found Calder still sitting with the child services worker. His eyes were wide, lips parted slightly. Then, without hesitation, he stood and walked, ran, toward me. He threw his arms around my waist, burying his face against my stomach. Can I come home now, Mom? I felt my throat close, not from pain, but from everything that had built up over the weeks, the months, the years. I bent down, kissed the top of his head, and whispered, Yes, baby. Yes, you can. The room around us blurred. My parents didn't speak. Rafferty didn't move. Selphia was gone. I hadn't even seen her slip out. There was nothing left to say. I held my son, not like someone who'd won something, but like someone who'd just reclaimed what should have never been up for debate. A month later, Calder and I moved into a modest two-bedroom apartment just west of the city. It wasn't fancy. The carpet still held the scent of the last tenant's lavender plug-ins, and the cabinets in the kitchen creaked when you opened them too fast. But it was ours. No cameras, no whispers, no eyes tracking us through courtroom glass. Just a quiet hallway, a key in my hand, and my son's sneakers scuffing across the floor as he explored what was now his room, his space, his freedom. Boxes still lined the walls. I hadn't unpacked everything. Not because I didn't have time, but because I wasn't in a rush. There was no deadline, no judge waiting, no war at my door. Some nights I sat on the couch, surrounded by cardboard and silence, letting myself feel the unfamiliar calm, the kind that doesn't demand anything from you, the kind that feels earned. One evening, after I'd folded the last load of laundry and tucked it neatly into drawers I hadn't yet labeled, I opened my top dresser and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside it lay a necklace, gold, delicate, and older than me by at least 2 generations. My mother had given it to me on my 18th birthday. Every woman in our family has worn this, she'd said. It means strength, tradition, and knowing your place. At the time, I smiled and nodded, grateful for the gesture. Now, years later, I understood that necklace wasn't a gift. It was a leash. That Saturday, just before noon, I drove to their house, the same house I grew up in, with its overly trimmed hedges and front door wreath that changed with every holiday. I didn't go inside. I didn't knock. I slipped the velvet box into their mailbox, along with a short note written in my hand. I carried this longer than I should have. I'm done carrying what was never mine. I walked away without looking back. The next morning, Calder and I went to Bird Park. He brought his bike, and I brought a coffee that had already gone cold by the time I found a bench near the lake. The sun peeked through the branches just enough to dapple the sidewalk with light. Ducks quacked. A jogger passed by, nodding a polite hello. I watched Calder pedal slowly, then pick up speed. He turned his head every few seconds to see if I was still watching. I always was. I stayed silent for a long time during that ride. Not the kind of silence I'd learned in court, measured, tactical, withholding, but the kind that sits in your bones when you know the worst has passed and what's left is yours to rebuild. I had stayed quiet for so long to protect him, to keep him from knowing the ugliness behind the custody battle, the betrayal, the lies stacked against his mother like bricks. But that same silence had nearly cost me everything. Later that evening, while Calder was putting together a Lego set on the floor, he looked up and asked me, "Are we rich now, because you're a judge?" I smiled and put my book down. "No," I said, sitting next to him. "But we're free, and that's richer than most people ever get." He nodded, satisfied, and went back to building. That night, after he fell asleep, arms wrapped around the stuffed dog he'd refused to bring to court, I sat at the kitchen table with a journal I hadn't touched in years. I didn't write about court rulings or policy changes. I wrote to Calder. The first line on the page read, Don't let anyone tell you who your mother was. You saw her. I kept going. I wrote about what it means to stand alone, about how sometimes even family won't protect you, about how silence can be noble and also dangerous. I wrote about strength that doesn't roar, but endures. The next day, I folded that journal and placed it in a box labeled simply, "For later." I didn't need to explain myself today, but one day, when he was ready, I wanted him to have my words, not just the ones spoken in court, but the ones that held the weight of everything I hadn't said aloud. That night, the air was cool. The city buzzed just faintly outside our window. Calder had fallen asleep early, worn out from the park, his body curled toward the wall. I stood at his doorway for a while, watching his chest rise and fall, his hair sticking up in all directions. The moonlight came in through the curtain, casting soft light across his face. I stepped in, gently closed the window a little tighter, and drew the curtain across. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt done, not defeated, not hardened, just done. With the war, the expectations, the roles I was forced into by blood and marriage. I didn't need their approval anymore, and I didn't need to explain my choices to people who had never tried to understand them. Justice isn't always a gavel or a verdict. Sometimes it's a child's hug at the end of a long day. Sometimes it's a quiet home filled with peace, and sometimes it's simply being able to walk away, whole. Sometimes justice isn't about proving you're right. It's about finally being seen for who you truly are, despite what others have tried to rewrite. Journey's story is a reminder that strength isn't always loud. It's often quiet, patient, and relentless. Have you ever been underestimated by the very people who were supposed to protect you? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful family stories just like this one.